Recently, I went for a prostate checkup and, let's just say, my body decided to surprise both me and the doctor. She simply nodded, saying, "It happens," but that didn't make me feel any less awkward. And it got me thinking, surely everyone has their own story about a weird, embarrassing, or funny visit to the doctor. Here are a few that you'll remember for a long time. When I was 18, I noticed a strange lump on one of my testicles. My doctor sent me for an ultrasound to rule out anything serious. I walk into the room, and there's a nurse in her mid-20s, the kind they could cast in a shampoo commercial without a second thought. She politely asks me to lie down, relax, and spread my legs just a little. I knew right then this was going to be a test of willpower. She applies gel to the probe, then to her fingers, and starts carefully examining the area. Honestly, within seconds my body decided we were at a very different kind of appointment, and it made that fact abundantly clear. I tried to save face by asking her about the machine and how it works, but she just smiled, carried on professionally, and even gave me a preventive tip for resolving the issue. Another friend of mine, at 16, had to see a cardiologist. The nurse who greeted him looked like nothing in life could shock her. Without hesitation, she told him to take off anything unnecessary and gave him a look that said she'd seen it all before. After that, he decided his next checkup would be in a different clinic. Then there was a guy who noticed some spots on his skin and immediately feared the worst. He went to the doctor, got referred to a specialist, braced himself for a scary diagnosis, and the doctor barely glanced at him before saying, "My friend, that's just a suntan in the wrong place." As a bonus, he later found out his ex had indeed been sunny with someone else, so the diagnosis was cosmetic, but the life lesson was serious. Sometimes, misunderstandings are pure comedy. A doctor says, "Open wide," and the patient, in full seriousness, opens their mouth and sits like that until the doctor clarifies they meant the eye. One teenager decided to crack a joke during his lower-level exam and made a cheeky remark to the medic. The doctor laughed, but later shared it with the boy's mother. That was a day he didn't forget. There was a man who ended up in the hospital after a car accident, and the emergency team had to remove all his clothing to check for injuries. Along with it, they discovered some very personal accessories he would have rather kept private. The most awkward part was when they politely returned all of it to him after the exam. Another story, a woman with a piercing in a very delicate spot. During her checkup, the doctor hinted that the metal was interfering with the equipment. She tried to remove it, but no luck. The doctor, turning away for decency, politely asked, "Shall I assist?" A few careful attempts later, the piercing surrendered, and the exam continued. One woman recounted giving birth. The doctors had to add extra fluid for flushing, but the baby blocked the way out. When the baby finally arrived, all of that fluid came out in a wave so spectacular the fully suited staff looked like they'd just been on a water ride. And now for stories that make even seasoned medical professionals go pale. One gynecologist recalled a 19-year-old patient who came in complaining of a foreign object. It turned out to be the plastic cap from a hairspray can, and she had put it there 4 years ago. Over time, it had become embedded in tissue and damaged internal organs. Removing it required several surgeries. There was a case where a patient, after major surgery, didn't wait for full recovery before resuming intimate life. It ended in serious complications and another operation. A medical student shared how a planned 3-hour ovarian surgery turned into a 13-hour marathon because of the extent of the disease. Multiple teams had to be brought in, and the patient received nearly half her total blood volume in transfusions. Sometimes they find things that absolutely shouldn't be there, like a potato, which had actually sprouted because the woman thought it was a home method of contraception. Another case involved a patient whose lack of hygiene left even veteran hospital staff stunned. There were also comic moments, a patient clamping her legs so tightly during an exam that the doctor couldn't work, or cracking jokes at exactly the wrong time. Gynecologists admit, the job can range from hilarious to difficult to truly tragic. But they all agree on one thing: if there's a health issue, don't be shy about seeing a doctor, don't delay the visit, and definitely don't experiment with questionable solutions. Imagine this: you fall asleep in one world, and open your eyes in another. As if someone quietly rewound the tape of your life, skipped a few scenes, then pressed play in a completely unexpected place. That's how people describe waking up from a coma. Each has their own story, with a hint of humor, a nod of pain, and a miracle that happened despite all the buts. Today I'll gather these stories into one, so we can walk together from the first breath after silence, to the moment when life starts laughing again. I'll start with a family legend. In the early 90s, my great-grandfather had a stroke, and for 3 long weeks he lay unconscious. When he finally opened his eyes, his native English seemed to have evaporated. He began speaking Choctaw. As a child, his family had lived near their community, he played with local kids, and easily picked up their words. Half a century passed, and memory seemed to have erased that file. But the coma opened an old archive. For 10 days he spoke only Choctaw, fluently, without an accent, using proverbs no one in the family remembered anymore. Then came a nightmare one night. He woke up, and once again, only English, not a single word of that ancient language. It was as if 2 switches lived in his head, each turning on its own reality. Stranger still, he could recall word-for-word conversations that took place in the hospital room while he was asleep, the orderlies' jokes, the rustle of newspapers, even short arguments among relatives, everything, like on a tape recorder. That was the first time I truly thought, the brain isn't a box of wires, but a mysterious theater where the play continues even with the curtain down. They say there are even more direct miracles. One young man, after a coma, suddenly began speaking Cantonese. No courses, no textbooks, he simply woke up, and the words, intonations, tones came out perfectly. Funny enough, that's how he met his future wife. She had come to visit a friend, overheard him asking a nurse, in Cantonese, whether she could bring him some oranges, and smiled with her eyes. They still argue about whom to thank for their marriage, fate, medicine, or those invisible desk lamps under which the brain sometimes rewrites itself. There's a painful story, but with a bright ending. A woman spent 4 days in a coma. She woke up, and everyone was talking about the baby. She didn't remember any pregnancy. In reality, her chronic illness had worsened, there had been a series of surgeries, and at 29 weeks, doctors performed a C-section. Her husband said that for the first hours she spoke in a tiny childlike voice, as if a little bell had settled in her throat. In the following days, her memory returned in pieces, first names, then hallways, and then, herself. The biggest surprise, of course, was her son, a tiny champion in the neonatal intensive care unit. Today, he's an 18-year-old giant towering near 2 meters, but back then he weighed less than a cat and breathed for both of them. There's a story about how the body can forget the simplest skill, breathing. A man spent 9 days in a coma, and when they disconnected him from the machine, he suddenly realized, the automatic inhale-exhale mode no longer worked. The first nights he literally managed each breath. If he drifted into sleep, an alarm would go off, beeping, and the nurse would call through the dim light, breathe. He'd nod, concentrate, count beats, 1, 2, pause, exhale. Within a month it all came back. But ever since, when someone nearby sighs too loudly, he smiles and says, "Yep, I know, that software freezes sometimes too." A coma can steal time. One man spent half a year in one, and woke up missing 15 years of memories. He remembered having 2 small children, didn't know about the third, and looked at a smartphone as if it were a prop from a sci-fi film. He had to learn again, not only to press buttons and tap a screen, but to accept the fact that his children's childhood had passed without him. His favorite word became, catch up. He asked to see videos of first steps, first performances in kindergarten, laughed half a beat late, but laughed. And when his eldest son threw him a ball and said, "Your pass, Dad," he felt for the first time that he was back in the game. Memory in a coma is a cunning storyteller. A woman spent 2 weeks in a medically induced coma and, upon returning, was convinced she had flown to Washington for treatment. It turned out her father-in-law had once loudly mentioned his business trip to Washington while in the room, and her brain spun a whole scenario from that phrase. She described seeing the monument, riding an elevator in a skyscraper, hearing English-speaking nurses laughing in the hallway. It took several days to gently bring her back to the map of our city. And yet, I like to think her brain gave her a little trip while her body was tied to the bed. Sometimes waking up feels almost like a prank. My mother's friend came to, sat up, and the first thing he asked was, "Where are my teeth?" Everyone searched, relatives, nurses, orderlies, even the roommate tapped the floor as if looking for a coin. Then the doctor showed an X-ray, found them. During intubation, they hadn't had time to remove his dentures, and they had ended up somewhere they definitely didn't belong. It all ended well, but he still likes to say, "I'm a mystery man. My teeth play hide-and-seek better than anyone." There's a short but warm sketch. A man with a brain tumor, upon waking for the first time, saw several nurses of Asian descent in his room and began apologizing to his relatives, "Sorry for making you fly all the way to Japan to visit me." They had to explain, this was our city hospital, just in a multicultural town. He blushed, laughed, and promised to learn a few Japanese phrases so he could be on top of things next time. Another story is about silence. A young man who had bacterial meningitis spent 4 days in a coma, and when he woke up, the world had no sound. Total silence. He spoke to his parents in a notebook, drew smiley faces for the nurses, and they replied with little hearts on sticky notes. A few weeks later, hearing returned in one ear. The other, never. Doctors said the odds had been slim, and he was one of those who survived on a thin thread. Since then, he loves rain, says the sound of drops on a canopy is like a gramophone that finally works again after a long pause. A coma can rewrite your traits. My friend's father, after a severe reaction to a contrast dye, woke up reinstalled. At first, he spoke in fragments, couldn't hold things properly, and spent months relearning to sit, stand, and walk. Later his speech came back, his hands grew steadier, but he became more irritable and sleepy. "At least you're still the guy who finds lost screws without a flashlight," his daughter told him. He smiled, "and still the guy who drags home 3 kilos of apples because they were on sale." Sometimes, it leaves behind superpowers. A 20-year-old, after a fall and a month-long coma, woke up with an eidetic memory. He could reproduce other people's conversations word for word, quote yesterday's news with the anchor's pauses, and recall the bus schedule he'd glimpsed from the corner of his eye. His family joked that one more concussion and he'd be reading minds. He'd shake his head, "No need. It's enough that I finally remember where I left my keys." Diabetic ketoacidosis throws you into another dimension of time. One patient said, "The years mashed together like lump-free porridge, and that's worse." In the first days after waking, the clock seemed suspicious. Sometimes it raced, sometimes it froze, sometimes it rewound. On insulin, each hour was like a pop quiz, and sleep broke into short fragments. Slowly, everything settled into place, and there came a quiet gratitude toward those who patiently repeated, "It's 11 now, yes, exactly 11. 6 weeks in a coma, and you return to a body you have to inhabit all over again." Speech stayed, but motor skills felt as if someone had switched the settings from normal to expert. The hardest part, the man laughed, was relearning basic household chores. And stairs, now that's no joke. After 3 weeks, he was tying his shoes, pouring tea, and taking pride in each steady step. I'm version 2.0, he said, and this time I read the user manual. A teenager who had spent over 3 months in a medically induced coma lost a lot of weight, muscle wasted away from immobility. When he first looked in the mirror, he said with genuine offense, "Did you all forget to feed me?" His family cried and laughed at the same time. "We didn't forget. We were waiting." Now he's regained the weight but kept the habit of saying, "Thank you," every morning to whoever brings food to the table. There's a story where waking up is like teleporting into a world that's already turned upside down. A man left on a business trip on September 2, 2001, got into a car accident, fell into darkness, and woke at the end of the month when the world's news was already different. Like someone paused an old movie and switched on another genre, he said. It took him a long time to adapt to the new rhythm, but the main thing was that he learned to laugh again, and would go to the park, where the trees still rustled with that same familiar leaf sound. Sometimes a coma isn't silence, but a slow recording on an inner tape. One man repeated the nurse's jokes word for word when he woke. They blushed, laughed, and promised to whisper only by the coffee machine from now on. A woman who'd dreamed of Washington spent a few days speaking with a slightly odd but funny accent. Saying "hospital" without smiling was impossible for her, and it was contagious. Humor is wonderful therapy. In rehab, one patient practiced handwriting every day, always drawing a little rooster in the corner of the page. "So I don't confuse today with yesterday," she explained. The nurses brought her colored pens, and soon a ritual appeared in the ward. The new day began with a tiny rooster on paper. Another patient, who had perfectly retrained his automatic breathing, was awarded the golden lung, a medal made from a bottle cap and a mask strap. He wore it like an order of honor and winked, "You don't unlock this feature every day." There are also little, funny details that cling to the heart. One dad stubbornly insisted he had only one son. The family carefully showed him photos. The second one, "Also yours, here's his first Christmas tree, here's his first bicycle." He was silent for a long time, studying them, then smiled and said the most correct thing, "All right, now I have 2 of the best surprises in my life." Another man who partially lost his hearing learned to build the world with other senses. He grew to love warm teas, weighted blankets, and the smell of cinnamon in the kitchen. "There are fewer sounds," he said, "but more shades. A coma sometimes opens hidden rooms." One man, after prolonged sedation, suddenly developed a passion for cooking. He said taste and smell came back in high definition. His homemade pasta became a legend in his apartment block. Neighbors brought their sauces for tasting, and he rated them like a judge on a cooking show. "Maybe," he laughed, "my brain just woke up the Italian uncle who was napping inside me." Some scenes teach simple things. A man recovering from an injury proudly demonstrated how he could go up and down stairs on his own. Each flight, a small victory. He reached the bottom, sat on a bench, and quietly said, "This is the most beautiful stairwell in the world." There was nothing special there, just gray paint and ordinary railings. But when you've just regained the right to climb, each step bears the names of those who waited at the bottom. I like the story about the living alarm clock. After her coma, one woman was afraid to sleep. Her dreams were vivid and strange. Her husband bought a simple clock with soft light and recorded his voice on it. "Hey, I'm here. It's Monday. You're home." When she dreamed something troubling, the scheduled light would gently glow, and his voice would remind her, "Here and now, everything is fine." Within a month, the nightmares faded. But the alarm stayed, because now it was theirs. The story of new names also belongs in this mosaic. After waking, a woman called her husband by another name for several days. It was the name of a hero from her favorite TV series, which had been quietly playing on the corridor television all that time. He laughed, "So I'm officially a hero now?" She blushed, got confused, then promised not to turn on the TV without headphones. Within 2 weeks, it passed, but at home, he still sometimes winks and calls himself that fictional name when bringing her coffee in bed. There's also a lesson in the power of little things. After a coma, one woman lost part of her long-term memory. She looked at family photo albums as if they were the beautiful life of someone else. Her daughter invented a simple game. Every day they'd pick one photograph and tell its story from scratch: who was in it, what the air smelled like, what sounds were in the background, whose laughter was ringing. Within a month, they were laughing at the made-up facts they'd invent if the real ones didn't come back. In this picture, the cake attacked first. And thanks to the laughter, memory, like a cat, began creeping out from under the bed. Sometimes people return from a coma with unexpected courage. One guy who had feared water since childhood agreed to aquatic therapy after rehab, and fell in love with the pool. In the water, he said, I felt for the first time that I could move without pain. Now he brings playlists of rain and ocean sounds to the pool, and his coach always jokes it's a spa for the brain. One more funny but very human scene. A man relearning to write stubbornly placed a period before a comma. Doctors corrected him, explained, but he'd say, let it be. Now I put a period, then take a pause, that's my personal grammar. Sometimes his mistake was beautifully fitting, alive. And that's the main thing. Who are we to disagree? I always remember what a nurse once told me: sometimes the hardest thing is the first laugh. A person is afraid that laughter will shatter them like a clay vase. And then you have to bring in a small, careful joke. Like the one once heard in a ward: today's menu, X-ray with vanilla flavor. The patient gave a meaningful look, only if it's seedless. And the whole ward exhaled, with laughter. That's how more than one recovery began. I'd like to say all these stories are about incredible miracles. And they are. But they're also about the simple things we easily lose in daily life: a breath that doesn't need instructions, a step you don't have to rehearse, the voice of someone dear you don't have to piece together letter by letter. A coma is darkness, but often after it, the light seems brighter, not because it has changed, but because we've learned to notice it. And finally, something I've heard more than once from those who woke up: don't chase after what's lost. Create something new. They don't say it like motivational speakers, but like people who had time to look at life from the other side of the blanket. Let your morning tea smell a little stronger than yesterday. Let a friend's call sound like a theater premiere. Let the stairs be not an obstacle, but the route to your favorite windowsill. We can argue forever about what happens in the brain when it switches off. Whether it listens to our voices, builds new cities out of them, or silently repairs its own bridges. But when it brings us back, it does so with a strange, almost childlike love for details. And then we see that life isn't made of seasons and episodes, but of small scenes where the main role is played by being present. So if you ever get the chance to be next to someone waking up, just be there. Speak calmly, repeat their name, hold their hand, laugh shyly and gently. And if it's you who has to wake up, know this: the world knows how to wait. It's as patient as a nurse with a warm blanket, and as inventive as a brother who brings your favorite tea to the hospital room. And in the end, it's as happy as you are when something once thought to be lost magic works again: a breath, a step, a word. And then, another one. And another. And another. Because that's what life is: a big story made of many small ones, and each of them is worth telling.